Hi, it's Todd of Todd's Workshop here at the Wallace Collection with Dr Toby Capwell. And we're here on behalf of Medieval Myth Busting, the Arrows vs Armour series. Really just to have a bit more of a chat about the history of Agincourt, what happened on the day of that battle, the order of events, and really just to go through it sort of in more detail. So, Toby, really started off. How did it go?
And one of the reasons we chose Agincourt is because it's actually really well documented. There are English official accounts, there are French chronicle accounts based on eyewitness testimony. We know the ground. We know more about this battle and we have a better chance of understanding it than most. And that's good because it's also one of these, mythologized battles, perhaps the most mythologized of all battles. And I mean, the whole process of how Agincourt got mythologized and why is fascinating. And much more complex than we might think. But we also have the battle. I'm personally, although I am interested in myths and stories, telling and things like that, I want the facts.
So, I'm the Duke of Brabant. I wake up at 9 o'clock in the morning, day of the battle. I have my nice little hot posset and my bread roll. Then what? Right.
Well, yeah, okay. The Battle of Agincourt is the end result of a military campaign. Henry V had invaded Normandy with the ultimate goal of becoming King of France and taking a right that he felt had been his. After having taken the port city of Harfleur, he took his army across country through northern France, moving from west to east, from Harfleur in Normandy all the way through to the Pas de Calais. It's hard to know why he was doing this, and different historians have different ideas, but it certainly seems like he's trying to get a fight. He needed a decisive victory to promote his cause. And it actually took quite a while for the French to respond. And ultimately, the French had different armies coming from different places and all trying to intercept him and trap him, and he crosses the Somme and then moves north, but they're already in front of him. And there was a lot of maneuvering to begin with. But the point was, when they got to Agincourt, Henry was a bit trapped, but he was still in a position to choose the ground. And he's got one highly organized, very well disciplined army made up of people who've been fighting and living together for weeks, and he's facing a conglomeration of several different French armies, all pulling together. And the problem with the French side was that nobody was really in charge. There were several princes of the royal blood there, and of course each of them all thought they should be in charge. They also had other veteran military commanders who should have been listened to perhaps, but weren't so much. The English had also captured the French battle plan, which is an important thing.
Oh,
so,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. There was a lot of clandestine stuff going on with scouts intercepting other scouts, and there's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff happening before the armies actually met. And, French messenger got jumped by some English in the woods, and they got the actual written battle plan, which survives.
Oh,
yeah.
Right.
And the battle plan is a window onto what the French intended to do. Their original plan was really good, but Henry's response, knowing what they're thinking, is to put himself in a place where they can't do what they wanted to do. They wanted to use big detachments of cavalry, not in a frontal attack like at Crécy or earlier battles, but they wanted to pincer movement and hit him in the flanks with the cavalry, which would have been really effective. I mean, that is the right thing to do against massed archers. That's what they were going to do, and then advance on foot. They always had this plan to use cavalry and heavy infantry together.
Because by that point they had established that going in on horses against archers in a frontal assault was always a very risky thing, and that you're much better off by being on foot.
Right. I mean, it's important to mention that none of the individual French people at the battle had fought the English before in a major battle. You know, the French at Agincourt are not the same French people as the ones at Crécy. The ones at Agincourt are new to this, and they haven't fought a major field battle against the English before. So Marshal Boucicaut, one of the military commanders at Agincourt, had a lot of fighting experience, but this was still the first time in this situation. They had a good plan, and it made perfect sense on paper, but Henry found out about it and placed himself in an area that was closely hemmed in with dense growths of trees on both sides. So that was a lot of protection for his archers from the sides. And that's like archers in Battle 101. You got to protect them.
Yeah.
You don't deploy your archers unless they're protected. They got to be protected by trees, stakes, ditches, heavily armed knights, rivers, whatever. Your archers have got to be protected. If you put them out in an open plain without protection, they're going to get annihilated. And they did on many occasions. There's plenty of battles in this period that the English lost, and the English archers and men-at-arms weren't able to do what they wanted to do. So the French have a record of winning too at this point. And let's not forget that.
Because that is easily forgotten, because you think that the English won every time, or the longbow won every time, that it was like victory, victory. And you do forget that there are losses as well, because of course they don't sit high in the mythology. Right.
Well, you don't talk about those because it spoils the myth that you're trying to build, and so it's typical selection, selection bias. And so we got to watch out for that. So the French had a good plan, but Henry outmaneuvered them, and they couldn't do what they planned to do. And because they didn't have a rigid or clear command structure, they couldn't effectively change what they were going to do. And essentially, they tried to do it anyway, even in a topographical environment where it was inappropriate.
Right. Is it essentially that the French were smaller armies, if you like, that had come together each with their own agendas under their own noblemen, and the overarching cause was sort of forgotten about for their own individual aims? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, they all wanted the same thing. They all were deeply affronted that the English king is marching through northern France with big fleur-de-lis on his helmet. And the English royal coat of arms itself is an affront because it's quartered with the arms of France. It's a visual promotion of the agenda, but they all wanted that. But there wasn't a command structure. No, it wasn't clear who was in charge, and it wasn't clear what the approach was going to be. And the opportunity to kill the English king in hand-to-hand fighting is sort of something that quite understandably everybody wanted. And Henry was in arraying himself in the middle of his battle line with this crown on his helmet and the royal coat of arms and the gilded armor. He's like an anglerfish, dangling himself out in front of them. And what that does is it makes them, when they make their main advance on foot, 9,000 heavily armored knights or something like that, they all go for the center. And they ignore the flanks, which was fine in the original plan, because in the original plan they were going to have destroyed the flanks with the cavalry. But they hadn't achieved that. They went ahead anyway. And you imagine these extended flanks of the English army with hundreds and hundreds of archers in them. And the French are marching straight past them to get to the center. And so there's a lot of opportunity in the battle to shoot people from the sides, and of course from the front, and ultimately even possibly from behind.
So once they've passed, you've got the French knights are going to be literally the focus of arrows coming in from every direction.
And that's the important point. This is a story of an English army that, as we've said, has a very clear command structure, very high morale, very well disciplined. They have force diversity. They have archers and fully armed knights and men-at-arms who are used to working well together to capitalize on each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. And they've got their king on the field. The French don't have their king on the field. They don't have force diversity because they're all fully armed knights and men-at-arms.
Yeah.
They had archers there, but they didn't use them. You can only count the ones that engage.
The ones at the front.
The ones who are actually doing the fighting. If they don't engage, they do not count. And it was a force made up entirely of guys in full armor on the French side. Now those guys have advantages. They have their strengths. When they hit the English line, they still push the whole English line back a spear's length, as some of the accounts say. So even despite all their problems, the thick, gluey Pas de Calais mud that they're having to march through, the fact that they're wearing their armor in the heaviest configuration because they know they're going to be getting shot at, the lack of command structure, all of that, the fact that their enemy is determining everything about this fighting situation. That's a bad situation to be in. You don't want your enemy deciding how this is going to go. But that's what's happening. And even then, they managed to make a really significant impact with the English line. And there's a lot of fighting. So that's the core thing. And the role of archery in that, I've always suspected, is much more complicated than just mowing people down.
Could I just take you back a little bit during the day? You were talking about how the French had the plan that the cavalry was going to come in from the sides of the archers, and that even though effectively their plan was stymied by the layout of the English forces, they still went for that anyway. They still tried to do that. So there was a marshalling of cavalry, and the cavalry went forward in the early stages of the battle. And then what? There was long-range shooting from the English to sort of disrupt them or target the horses, or what do we know about that?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read all the comments, but I read as many of them as I could. And the whole question of range came up, and the whole question of horses came up. And, those kind of have to be addressed together, but also individually. As far as the role of cavalry in the battle, it's important to stress that although there was cavalry action at Agincourt, it wasn't really the meaningful stage of the battle. They tried this thing, it didn't work, they moved on with their main advance. And that's important because there were earlier battles, Crécy being the obvious example, where it really was armored cavalry versus the English on foot. And the archers having to repulse front-line cavalry charges. And I think in the mythologizing of this, we tend to forget that Crécy and Agincourt are completely different battles. They didn't go down the same way at all.
Yeah.
And the role of the cavalry were there, and archers were shooting at horses in both battles, but it was two very different situations.
So the Agincourt, the full frontal cavalry charge, was never intended,
and was never attempted, and
was not delivered.
Right. They wanted, their original battle plan said, attack them from the sides, fast and hard, break up those archers, destroy their ability to shoot on a mass scale, or at least deplete, downgrade the effectiveness of the mass shooting by killing and disrupting as many of them as you can from the sides where they're weak and vulnerable, and then move the main force in on foot. And that first part of it just didn't work out. So the English did have the full power of their massed shooting, which was ultimately really damaging to the French advance on foot. So the crucial thing about this battle is the advance of large numbers of armored knights and men-at-arms on foot, and what the English are doing about that at long range, medium range, and short range. And let me just say one thing about the range, because in our first main film, I referred to the archers shooting at short range. That's what I said. I kept saying short range. And I've realized that I've got into the habit of talking about shooting at short range talking about this stuff for a number of years. And I've gotten into that habit because I'm at pains to stress that the distances are shorter than we might imagine. A longbow might be able to throw an arrow 400 yards or whatever, but that's well beyond maximum effective range, I think. That's hypothetical.
We will come back to that.
We're going to get to that. So when I've been stressing short range, I mean short range in a modern sense. I don't mean what the medieval archer regarded as short range. Short range in the age of high-powered firearms is 150 meters. 150 meters is pretty short range, but that might very well be a much longer range for the English archer. We need to determine that. So I just want to put that proviso in, that I'm not saying they didn't shoot at what they regarded as long range. What I'm saying is that that's shorter than what we might imagine it to be. Obviously there's a lot more work to do on that. I would love to be able to do more experimental work, working on a number of different levels, to be able to say more about what is the maximum effective range of Joe's 160-pound yew longbow. Because the archers have to make choices about that. The archers have got a limited number of these arrows, so they have to always make a judgment. I might be able to get the arrow that far, but is it going to do anything when it gets there? Do I feel confident that when I shoot, my arrow has the best chance of doing some damage? Now, if you're shooting at, a cavalry charge coming at you, and you can see all the way down range that those horses aren't wearing very much armor, then you might go for the longer range. Your arrow is losing energy the second it leaves the bow. But is that acceptable at this range or that range, depending on what I'm shooting at? And it depends what you're trying to achieve.
But with that subject of range, so my understanding is that there would have been, or was, some long-range shooting at the cavalry as they started to come in. I mean, do we know that for a fact?
Well, it seems that in the original lines of battle, the French and the English sat there staring at each other for a while, yep, and nobody did anything. And this was fine for the French, because the longer they wait, the more troops arrive. And they've got more people coming in all the time. Henry's got who he's got. And the longer he waits, and the longer the French just sit there, the more and more dangerous it's getting for him. So it was hugely important that the English somehow goad the French into attacking them. Mm-hmm. And so what they did was they upped sticks, literally, and they advanced their whole line. And I think what they were doing is they were advancing their line into maximum effective bow range. Now, what is that? We need to work on that. They advance to that maximum effective range, and they start shooting. And at the maximum effective range, they might not be doing the maximum damage, but it's going to be enough damage to make the French go.
And the expectation of that is not going to be 10 shots a minute from every archer, pump them out, let's stop it. You're sending 1 or 2 shafts a minute, or whatever it might be, enough to annoy the French and to make them go, you know what, let's go deal with this.
It's all about making your enemy fight on your terms. If King Henry could make the French attack him, he is deciding what they do. He is dictating the play of this thing. The French could have attacked them when they were still setting up, when they're putting their stakes in and things, and the French could have decided to try and get the jump on them. But they didn't. And they're lucky that they didn't. Who is deciding what happens when? And the archers have a role to play in that. So when they begin shooting at maximum effective range at the beginning of the battle, there's a certain effect that they're after. They're just trying to get to that tipping point when the French allow themselves to be dictated to. Yeah. And they go. And then once they go, you've still got 150 meters of these guys in 35 kilos of armor slogging through thick mud. It's going to take them 3 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe even 10 minutes to get to within axe range of you. That's still a whole lot of time to be shooting away at them.
And so sort of the early long-range, classic Hollywood elevated bow is about harassing, goading the enemy, getting them to start coming forward. And then you put the longbows into play, as we saw in the film with Joe, of getting them shooting flat at the maximum killing effectiveness, which you're not doing at an elevated shot.
So the fact is, though, that there isn't any medieval image that shows an archer in a field battle shooting up in the air in this period. And you could say that, well, medieval art isn't realistic, but it still gives you a good sense of what the artists think this stuff looks like. And we know from the mythologizing of Agincourt in modern children's books of the 19th, 20th centuries, of the Olivier film, the Kenneth Branagh film, that when an archer does that, it's so iconic.
Well, it's great.
And it's definitive. So if they were doing it, you would see it in the art, even if the distances are weird and the backgrounds are weird and the armies aren't showing enough people, whatever. There's that body shape. And it just isn't there, except when they're in sieges and they're shooting at people on walls. Then they show it. They draw it when they know it's supposed to be there.
Sieges and naval, you do see it. And I agree with that. But where I'm a bit lost about this, the elevator shooting in a field context would have uses. It would have uses for annoying a body of cavalry 250 metres out, something like that. Just to move them from that little spot there to move them slightly further away, or whatever it may be, so that they steer around the stream that they can't see from where they are. Whatever it is, there would have been times you would have done that.
Maybe it just isn't worth the arrows. Maybe whatever you could achieve is not worth the expenditure of your valuable arrows. Yeah. So one question might be in the future for Joe, for example, is how much can you elevate before it looks like you're elevating? And how far do your arrows go when you do that? And then how much energy have you retained from the total potential energy of the shot?
Well, that is, without a doubt, that is something that we have to look at, is what energy is maintained and what momentum, because momentum is has a very strong relationship to penetration. Yes. So what energy and what momentum is retained at what distances. Yeah. And that's one that we have to come and look at again.
And I just think it motivates us to, at some point, do more work on the ranges of longbow shooting, and what can you achieve at shooting at different ranges. Yeah. And what choices are they making when they do that? And that relates to the rate at which they're shooting and lots of other things as well.
It's interesting you're saying that the French knights actually passed the English lines, which meant these shooting lines, which meant that they could actually not only shoot from the front but shoot from the sides, and in fact possibly even shoot from the back, which of course leaves you far more vulnerable as a knight.
At a late stage in the battle, there is a suggestion in some of the French accounts that they felt that they'd been entirely surrounded. Yeah. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility. No. The main thing is that if you imagine the English arrayed like a V, and the French are going for the center to kill Henry and the nobles, then the guys at the wings have lots of opportunities to shoot at the sides, and some of them are hiding in the woods, and they can run around the back and shoot from the back, probably at a late stage in the battle.
That'd make you uncomfortable, wouldn't it?
It would be really bad.
So obviously in our first film we're shooting the breastplate plumb on from the front, and it comes down to a time issue, frankly, with the filming of it. What we'll do is we'll come and have a look at shooting from the side as well. I mean, it's got to be a given. Yeah. And I mean, you were making a good point earlier about how were people hurt. People were hurt. Yeah. I mean, how were they hurt?
As it's a response film, I guess the main other point I want to stress in all of this, because when you're focusing on specific things, as you have to, it's very easy to overemphasize what you're concentrating on to the exclusion of everything else. And this is a very complex physical situation that we're dealing with. We got to pull it apart. We got to test certain things methodically. It's easy then to say, what if this, what if that, what if this? Well, we're working on it. But we got to be kind of methodical about it. If we get nothing out of this from me in this film, I want to stress that nobody is saying the longbow is an ineffective weapon. That's not what we're saying at all. It's very clear from all the sources at Agincourt on both sides that lots of French knights and men-at-arms got killed by archers shooting arrows at them, and the arrows are killing them and hurting them and doing damage. Nobody's questioning that at all. What we're saying is it's perhaps not happening the way we might imagine it happening. We know that they are able to kill these people even though they are wearing good equipment. So what is really going on? How are they able to get past really good armor? And that doesn't make the French stupid for wearing the armor, because it would have been a whole lot worse if they hadn't been wearing it. There aren't actually that many battles in medieval history where you can show English archers shooting at people who don't have armor.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of instances. The Battle of Stoke Field in 1487 is a good example of that, where the Yorkist army has a lot of Irish fighting men in it who don't have any defensive armor really, and it's an absolute massacre. So wearing the armor is a good idea, even though it's not, of course, 100% protection.
Armor never is.
What I like about this project is that we can start to replace some of that supposition with some fact, and it's never perfect, but we can do our best, and we can do something useful. I mean, especially with the practical work. Practical investigation of arms and armor and medieval fighting and so forth has gone places in the last 10 years nobody could ever have expected. And when you put yourself in the practical situation, you find out new things, but sometimes you can just make sense of weird things in the existing evidence that were hard to understand before.
Yeah.
And in that way, you then make a connection. And suddenly that isolated bit of evidence and this isolated bit of evidence are suddenly singing from the same page.
15, 20 years ago, certainly, there weren't people really shooting heavy bows. And if they were shooting heavy bows, they weren't traditional English longbows. The whole sort of warbow archery style that you see in all the pictures and that Joe was exhibiting in the film is something relatively new. And so you go back certainly 20 years, and that very test that we did today, even if you had the breastplate, even if you had all of us standing there and doing all the same things, would not have been possible because there was nobody like Joe 20 years ago.
And similarly with the armor. And there's lots of people now who have lots of experience fighting in full play armor. And that starts to give you more of a window on the perspective of the people who are really there. 20 years ago, you would not be able to say, for example, that the armor that the French were wearing when they advanced towards the English could be worn in a number of different ways, depending on the situation. And even though it is configured in different ways, it might not look appreciably different from the outside, from the point of artists, depicting it. But essentially the same equipment could be worn in a configuration where it's 20 kilos total weight or 35 kilos total weight. And I know, as someone who fights in armor, and a lot of other people know the same thing, that even if you change the weight of your armor by 3 kilos, it's a meaningful difference. And it changes what you can do for how long and so forth. So, our understanding of the physical environment, just through the proliferation of practical interests, has really transformed. And the basic history is still catching up. There's loads of people out there who are fighting in armor at the weekends who have a much better sense of what that French advance might have felt like. But they're not the people that are, charged with professionally writing stuff down, or they don't end up on YouTube films all the time, although probably some of them do. but we got to catch up with where we are with our investigative abilities, and it feels like that's what this project's about.
That's one of the things actually I like about this is how many people watched the last film, 2.5 million or something?
Yeah.
There's 2.5 million heads out there thinking, commenting, bringing up sources, talking about stuff. And it's opened up the world to people like me who are not professional academic historians. I mean, I alluded in my last response film that I'm just a bloke by a shed and we're going to go and see Dr Toby Capwell to get some better answers. And the bottom line, that's true. I benefit from the work that you and your colleagues do on writing this, the books that you write, and researching and developing our knowledge of the whole area. So when we talk about primary sources, and when people put in a comment about a source that they've got, I mean, how should this all be approached, really from an academic point of view?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different kinds of evidence that we can work with. I think one of the limitations of this kind of historical inquiry historically has been is that any given scholar or researcher has tended to work with one kind of evidence. So you're a textual historian, or you're an art historian, or you're an archaeologist. And the good ones always look at other types of evidence to give color and perspective and context to what they're primarily concerned with. But I think it's only been fairly recently that, most universities, most academic bodies generally, have really started to encourage interdisciplinary research, where you are actively pulling different kinds of evidence together and trying to build a better representation of the reality that you're concerned with. So, we've got to be dynamic with the way we use the evidence, and we have to be very precise about how we use the evidence. If we're working with documents and written accounts of this eyewitness says this happened at the Battle of Agincourt, we have to be very careful, for example, of working in translation. It's useful a lot of times to work with translations, but sometimes you can get the wrong idea if you don't check it against the actual words that the original author used. So I think precision is really important, and being clear about what's in the evidence versus what you're making of it. And the hypothesis is important. You have to have an idea of what you think is going on, and then you've got to use the evidence against that, and you've got to be prepared for being wrong. And you've got to change your idea in the face of good evidence. And it's sometimes easy when you've worked with a subject a long time to forget to go back to the basics. I was just looking at some of the textual sources for Agincourt again this morning. And, I'm very struck again by how they talk about the effectiveness and that people are being killed by those arrows, and everybody agrees it's a great weapon. Nobody contests that, but how does it really work? And what was so effective about, the way that Henry V specifically was using his archers? If there's graduate students working on 15th century sources out there and you find something that you think is important, tell us. But don't just tell us, oh, I read somewhere that this. We need to know where our evidence is coming from. And that's why footnotes are important. Yeah. But if you've got them, absolutely, we want to know about them.
I mean, I do think it is important. It's especially important for this, actually, because let's just say we're still making these films in 5 years' time, which would be great. We're going to look back on earlier stuff and go, oh, we got that wrong. And it is to be accepting of when you're wrong and to be accepting of what you don't know. And you can strive to improve on both of those things. Mm-hmm. But to say that you don't get things wrong and that you know everything are two meaningless statements.
You got to start somewhere. And as you do it, as we do these shooting tests, we'll get better at it. And then we might, and then we'll go back and try to revise. But, you got to start somewhere.
We've got a few minutes spare now with Dr. Toby Capwell, so we're just going to run through some of those stupid questions, or not so stupid questions, that I have wondered for years, or I've heard about, or my mates have talked about and claim a fact. So we're just going to go through it in a very informal, unstructured way. So, right at the end of the battle, I've heard the English archers took all the prisoners and then ended up having to slaughter them. Basically losing all their ransoms is the version I hear. True, not true, in between?
Partially true. They did kill some prisoners because they were worried at one stage that they had so many prisoners, they couldn't guard them and continue to fight the battle at the same time. And King Henry ordered that the prisoners should be killed because it was a tenuous position. Initially, a lot of his troops refused to do it, and then they did kill some of them. but then they stopped. So they killed some, but they didn't kill all of them.
So when his troops refused to do it, presumably that's from a financial point of view or a moral point of view, or do we not know?
Well, I don't want to say what was in the minds of these people, but there was certainly a financial hit to be taken when you've got a really valuable nobleman who you can sell back to his family for a lot of money, and then you're just going to cut his throat. I mean, if you just take the human element out of it completely, there's a major financial disincentive to do this.
Yeah. Not that there were rules of war, but the rules of war were broken by the English on that day, really? Or were there precedents to it? I mean, was it just something that was just not done and was looked down on, as my understanding is, was looked down on by the rest of Europe as a pretty dirty day?
Well, you know, it's a fluid thing. And it depends how it gets spun later. On a basic human level, it seems like it's, you know, morally reprehensible to kill unarmed people who you've taken prisoner in good faith. And I think there's undoubtedly a level of that where the medieval people would acknowledge that. On the other hand, it was a potentially desperate situation, and some of these prisoners might have been making indications that they were going to violate the prisoner-captor contract by getting up and attacking them, which you're not supposed to do either. You know, when you're taken prisoner, there's an agreement on both sides. You know, you get kept in an open prison with the agreement that you won't try to escape. So it's a tricky thing. But it still looks bad. There's no question that it looks bad.
Pointed stakes. So, this is an interesting one. I'm going to pull you up on this. We mentioned the word pointed stakes, and you went as if you're knocking it in the ground, right? Now, there are accounts, aren't there, correctly, that the archers had to carry a pointed stake.
Right. Again, it's this thing about needing to protect your archers. And if you can't count on having hedges for them to hide behind, or a river, or a ditch, or forest, or whatever, it's a good idea to carry your fortification with you. So the archers at Agincourt had each a long wooden stake that were set up in front of them.
Now the thing about this is I ponder things on rainy days when I haven't got anything to do. And I've always wondered, because you see the artwork and it's always a pointed stake with a point outwards.
Right.
And if you hammer that in, if it's got a point on it, you hammer it in, you knock the point off, and okay, you can whittle it back on. But then when you're removing big chunks of timber, you've got to do that with an axe. And if it's buried not that deep in boggy ground, the whole thing is going to be flopping around by the time you've done it with an axe or a billhook. So you can't sharpen them afterwards. So I've always wondered about this, and the only conclusion I can come to is that you have the point that is driven into the ground and then the flat end down. I might be the only person out here who goes, yeah, well, of course, that's like obvious. But actually, in every portrayal you see, it's a pointed end coming out of the ground. And I can't see how they can achieve that.
I have been worried about the idea of hammering a sharp point. Quite apart from ruining the point, it's not going to be very effective, and it's just it's a weird thing to be doing. It doesn't seem to make sense. I have worried about it, but I haven't thought that much about it. You know, one has to think about the diameter of the stakes too. I mean, they're not giant, great tree trunks, are they? But how narrow can they be before they're not effective? And really, all you need is a deterrent for the cavalry. And if it's inconvenient for infantry advancing into you as well, so much the better. But it's really an obstacle. It's not a spear.
I think that's the point. In my head, I always think of it like a sharpened stake sticking out of the ground. And I suspect it's just quite simply an obstacle.
I think, but I have to check if we're going to get into this seriously, I think there are depictions of stakes being used and the points are sharpened. But you'd have to judge the artwork. And is this someone 100 years later illustrating a text that they've been given, and they make the same assumption? I don't know how you'd investigate that, because I don't know what the primary evidence is going to be.
No, but it's just one... It's one of these things. It's part of the myth of Agincourt. Is we all know that they have sharpened stakes and they hammer the sharpened stakes in. But actually, do we know that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of first the Scots building obstacles to use against the English heavy cavalry, you know, during the Wars of Independence. in the 13th, early 14th centuries. And the English actually get this idea of fighting the way they fight because of the way the experiences against the Scots. And the Scots supposedly did sharpen stakes and plant them in the ground, more like, punji sticks or something. You're meant to step on them, and they're smaller. But, there is a sharpened stake thing in the repertoire. But on the other hand, if it's a big, whether it's sharp, not, or otherwise, if it's projecting at an angle level with a horse's chest or whatever, it's still going to be effective. It doesn't need to be sharp to do a job.
It needs to put the horse off. That's the point.
It just needs to keep them from smashing through your line, with impunity.
Yeah. All right. So, reenactorisms. You will have heard the phrase.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I'm an occasional reenactor sitting around the fire. We all love a good story, and we tell it to the people who come round. The English were threatened with having their fingers cut off by the French. So that's why we greet the French like that. Sorry, French people. True? Not.
I don't know. I am vaguely aware of problems with this story.
It's a good story.
That the archer, the whatever this insulting gesture is, comes from archers. That sounds to me like something that isn't true. It's a good story, it's fun to tell at parties, it's a clever thing to know, and that's precisely why I would be skeptical of its validity.
All right. Moving on quickly?
Yeah, keep going. Let's get past that.
The English had dysentery so badly, and they didn't want to stop marching, that they cut the arse out of their hose so that they could basically just void their bowels. They could go to the toilet at the side of the road without having to take their breeches down.
Completely untrue.
Lovely.
Completely. Can I?
So disappointed me. Carry on.
Can I explain?
Yeah.
Okay. It's completely untrue. There is some of the accounts of the battle say that the archers were wearing their hose low. But none of them had dysentery. This is a major part of the myth. It's a device that's used to exaggerate the danger of the English position, the jeopardy that they're in. They're up against it. They're not only are they outnumbered 10 to 1, they also are all sick and. And it just makes the whole victory that much more amazing, right? But they didn't, because there was a real problem with dysentery at Harfleur, at the siege of Harfleur, and people died of it, and but everybody who had it was sent home.
Right.
Anne Curry's got the documentation. We know who was sent home, and the people who were sent home were all the people with dysentery. The people at the battle were the people who weren't sick. Dysentery is not a part of the battle, it's a part of the campaign. So two different things.
Because dysentery is more about staying in one place, not about being mobile, isn't it? It's not to say you can't get dysentery when you're mobile, but it is that long-term toilets in one place, lack of hygiene thing.
Look, they can't have those people on their progress across France when they might have to fight a major battle at any time. It's better to send them home and work with fewer, healthier men. We've got their names. It's all written down.
Right. Lovely.
They forget it.
Good. Bad. That was a great story. Ruined. Sorry, everybody.
That's the whole point of this. Great story ruined by ugly facts. Right. But the reality, I think, is still more interesting.
Okay. The rate of infection from English arrow wounds was so high, the French thought that we poisoned our arrows. Theory being that our arrows were stuck in the ground, so there was mud there, defecation from being in the shooting lines and all that kind of malarkey. Even heard that before? I'm looking from your face, I haven't even heard that.
I have heard stuff about English archers rubbing gunk on their arrows for purposes of biological warfare or whatever. I think it's a stretch. I mean, maybe I would put that out to the world. Go out and find us evidence for this. If there is evidence for it, I'd really like to know. But we can't work with just the supposition of, oh yeah, they'd do it. I would do it if I was there.
It would work, but that's not the point.
It would work, but I think they're more concerned with putting arrows in people's bodies and, the wound being the focus. If they get infected and die later, that doesn't do you any good in the 1 hour or whatever of the battle. You know, what happens after the battle is not your immediate concern.
Sorry, the joy on my face there is I've just thought of another one that's not even on my list.
Okay, sure.
Right. I haven't read Roger Ascham in years, so I can't quite remember. But somebody put a reference saying that he said you put a blob of beeswax on the end of your arrow and that will make it go through the armour. Modern anti-tank rounds often have a sort of a washer around the head, which, I don't know, stabilises the head when it impacts the armour or something I frankly don't understand. Heard anything similar in arrows, crossbow bolts, putting a lead washer or a ball of beeswax or...
I've heard it in living history chit-chat, but I've never seen any primary source for it. On the other hand, I've never looked for it. So I'll say I don't know, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Toby. I'm sorry to put you through that because there was some nonsense in there. But it's great, actually, because I've learned things that I thought I knew for fact. And if nothing else, that's got to be what it's for. So thank you for spending the time.
My pleasure.
And thank you for having us here at the Wallace. Wallace Collection, fantastic place. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. We've got good stuff coming.